What do you think John Denver, Aretha Franklin, Martin Luther King Jr., Amy Winehouse, Jimi Hendrix, Marvin Gaye, Bob Marley, Howard Hughes, James Brown, Sonny Bono, and Prince have in common? They all died without a valid will. Today, we're going to explore the need behind having a will. What does that provide for the loved ones that you leave behind? Is creating a will for yourself, or is it for the people who will be left behind grieving? When we learn to grieve and move towards growth, we need to look at our grief presently and learn from it. And would not creating a will with the involvement of your family next to you lead to growing trust, love, a sense of peace within your family and friends? Today, I welcome someone who's going to have that very deep conversation with you. Greg Barnsdale is a death doula, certified financial planner, certified executor advisor, a hospice volunteer, and now an author of Do Not Ignore Your Mortality. His stories, his trials, and his experience will take you on a journey on a topic that none of us want to talk about, and that's creating your first will. Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award-winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Welcome back to Grief Uprooted. Today, I am going to tackle a topic that many of us don't want to talk about. But in the house today is Greg Barnsdale. Is a death doula, certified financial planner, certified executor advisor, and hospice volunteer, and now an author of Do Not Ignore Your Mortality. Welcome. How are you, Greg?
Thank you for having me, Christine. I appreciate it.
Well, before we start today's conversation, I kind of want to share with everybody the intro to your book. It is the most interesting one I have ever read. And I thought, these people will never read it, but maybe they will. And so I'm going to just take a moment to read it. To all the dead people I have met over my career, I'm sure many of you did not have your affairs in order. The endless stories I have heard and overheard from grieving relatives and friends clarify that many sour situations like yours could have been avoided. That has pushed me to the point of taking this bold stand. My commitment to all of you is to inspire many others to have their affairs organized. We both know the lingering regrets of not being prepared last an awfully long time. I love that. And so I'm going to let you tell our listeners what
Okay.
you're talking about.
Well, my writing and publishing coach highly recommended that I create an introduction that would really capture people's attention because with nonfiction books, as you're likely aware, Christine, people tend to gravitate towards that introduction at the very beginning of the book and also flip it over to see the testimonials on the back are very popular too. But this whole project of creating this book and creating this message, it took me many years to put this together. When I worked in the funeral industry, I gained a lot of experience and saw many of the mistakes people made. And then when I kept my funeral director's license, as I still have it today, 40 years later, and I migrated to the financial planning industry and then ultimately developed this interest in estate planning and proactive planning and such. But I saw the mistakes that so many people made, and I was compelled with trying to find a way, Christine, that would really help inspire people to be more proactive, because that's how we can avoid a lot of this crap that happens at the time of a death and thereafter.
And you know what? I love what you're using in the word inspire, but this has been in all like 24 years in grief, death, and dying. when people come to me when they're grieving, one of the biggest parts that they're struggling with is that will.
Yeah.
And, we're fighting, we're screaming at each other, and so's getting so much. And as an executor myself, um, I'm just gonna say it sucks. Like you're doing all the work, and even though you're getting like money means nothing at that point. It really does. But then to other people, it means a lot. And there's this infighting. But how do you, I guess one of my biggest questions, and maybe I would like to take a step back because I think something major has to happen to somebody to make them want to talk about this topic. I know you've been in the funeral industry. I know you're a death doula, financial planner. But releasing this book and what switched you to want to go, I think I need to have to help. Like I need to help people realize this.
Well, it was when I was relatively young and I joined the funeral industry back in the 80s. And ultimately, when I was asked to join this pre-need marketing team, a pre-arrangement team in Toronto, Ontario, here in Canada, and I worked in that role for a number of years, and I realized and witnessed firsthand all the positivity that could come out of being prepared and organized. And those types of situations, Christine, were so few and far between compared to the scenarios where we would see people calling or coming in the door saying, "My dad just died, my daughter just died," and it throwing them. It was unexpected. It was sudden. But as I said earlier, and again within this message within my book, proactive planning, having a will, and discussing with our family whether we want to be buried or cremated, and all these sorts of things have so many advantages.
They do. They do. And I think that something has to happen to you. I think our careers bring us there. But when you are faced with a medical condition, I know you have something that has like 1.7 million views.
Yeah.
And I believe that has that many views. I'll put the link in this podcast because you're authentically real. You see, I'd love for you to share what that moment was for you with everybody listening.
Okay. Well, it rocked me to my core. It truly did. Christine, after years and years and years of stressing to people as a funeral director, it's important to have your affairs together. Here's the advantages of pre-planning your funeral, etc. And then as a financial advisor, where all my clients knew what I had done in the funeral industry as a funeral director for years, stressing to them the importance of life insurance and health insurance and all those things that would help reduce the risk of a good retirement, in essence. I finally figure out how to publish a good, compelling book, which I did with Friesen Press out of British Columbia. And then 2 months after I published this darn thing, I was diagnosed with a large brain tumor. I went in with a sore neck thinking I'm spending too much time at the computer. And my general physician says, "Greg, don't worry about that. The MRI that you had done recently indicates a large brain tumor." And I'm awaiting a call back from the ear, nose, and throat specialist to get you in there as soon as possible. And he wouldn't tell me if it was cancerous or not.
Oh God. And what made you, because when I watched the video, it was like you just came out, I'm giving myself goosebumps. You just came out of the office and decided to record to your wife. Like what made you
Yeah.
do that? I would just be bawling.
Well, I had on the previous visit to my general physician, I had given him 3 or 4 copies of my book, and so he knew exactly where I was at and what I was doing. But he said, don't worry about your neck. Let's get this sorted out first. And he said, as soon as I hear from the ear, nose, and throat specialist, Greg will call you. So I had driven home about 20 minutes away, and I was just putting in the recycling bins. My wife was working from home that day, and my cell phone goes off, and it's the secretary from the ear, nose, and throat specialist. This was on a Thursday late morning, and she said,
Wow.
"Greg, the specialist wants you to come in Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Can you come in?" And I said, "Of course I'll come in." I hung up, and I was in shock, but I was convinced I was given a death sentence, that it was cancerous. I'd
Yeah.
had this ringing in my one ear for some time. That's what
Yeah.
spawned the MRI being done that was recommended for me by this ear, nose, and throat specialist. But I didn't want to go in and tell my wife because I'd ruin her day. And then I didn't want to ruin her dinner. And then I didn't want to ruin her sleep. And then I ended up telling her Saturday morning as Celine Dion's "My Heart Will Go On" is
Oh
playing as
my
we're having our coffee, and tears start running down my eyes. And she says, "What's wrong?" So I told her, and she was devastated.
God.
And then she was, short time later, she was on the phone, not, just speaking to her close friend. I wanted to give her some space. I went out to the vehicle and recorded that brief little video on my phone, not knowing if I would ever use it. And then my stepdaughter tells me 2 days before my brain surgery to get this tumor removed, non-cancerous, fortunately, that I had later found out after that weekend, that it blew up on TikTok, over 1.7 million views now.
It did. It did. And it was so short and so
Yeah.
simple. But it was just so authentic. Like I watched it and my eyes just welted because I thought, my goodness, like you
Yeah.
think, and when you work in this industry, I always say to my friends, don't ever come into my office. Don't come to my side of the fence. And when I was 14 and they had thought I had bone cancer in my legs, I just remember, oh, I can't make it through a podcast without crying. Everybody knows that who listens to this. I remember them saying, like, we're going to remove this part of your bone. And I remember asking, like, just do me in right now. Like, don't wake me up because the pain of watching somebody you love suffer is just horrible. It's just, and I think that's the hardest part. People say, well, dying is so hard. And I used to say to people, grieving is so hard. And then I watch people I love suffer. And I went, oh God, this is excruciating.
Yeah.
And you want to help them. And sometimes you want to help them, but they're not willing to have the conversation. And that's exactly what I think you're doing. I think you're presenting, look, this is how we have the conversation. And if we have the conversation, then your loved ones are going to grieve and they're still going to be hurt. They're still going to have that pain. But imagine knowing what your wishes are. Imagine kind of having a guideline. Because right now people are grieving. They have no guideline. They have nothing. They're just standing there going, what do I do next? And then they're relying on other people. But to have something in your hand, um, I want to share a little story with you is I've always been actively writing wills every stage of my life with my children. And I think one of my best moments was when my older daughter came to me and I decided to have another child at 40. And she came to me and said, could you please alter your will? And I said, excuse me? She goes, I want custody of my sister if anything happens to you. And
Wow.
her sister at the time was 12. And I went, well, she'll pretty much, I don't want any complications. And I thought, good for you. And so my two older children sat me down and said, we want you to alter your will. So we all did together. And then it got into my music and I was like, what? And they're like, your music that you've collected, you give me a break, right? But I thought this is so, it actually turned into a very cathartic experience for all of us. So I am gonna take a small break, but when we come back, we're gonna figure out how you can write your will, the listener, how you can start this process to make it easier for everyone you love. We'll be right back.
We interrupt this podcast for a dirty moment.
My dirty little moment is when I'm told that a close friend or relative has died. When I ultimately find out that they did not have a will in place, it has me wringing my hands thinking, why didn't they do it? It can cost so little money to do, and it can set up our family members for success. We all need to be doing this.
Okay, Greg. So we've talked about how we've got to this point and the importance of this. We're both in the field on complete opposite ends. But I would love to know, like, I really want my listeners, I know buying your book will help them walk through this, but from this podcast, I'd really like to know um, how do you even start that conversation with your family?
It's not easy. I get it. I know that speaking about someone becoming incapacitated or deathly ill or someone dying is can be very hard, especially for some people. You and I, Christine, find it a little easier because we've been in that field, and we know it's the lesser of two evils by being proactive and talking about these things. And that's why I was so torn with trying to create a book that had never existed before. And I've read many of these books on estate planning, and there's really not a lot of them actually. But I wanted to create a book that people would actually read and lean into. And it's just a conversation starter to get people speaking with their family about what they want to have happen. And I think that's the crux of your question here. How can we do it? Well, as I stress in the book, we can bring it up at a time when someone else's illness or death that we have heard of is talked about within the family. And I use those types of questions. I've only included a few questions within my book, but I've also come up with a list of probing legacy questions, I call them, 15 for basic situations and 15 for more advanced situations to help people get these conversations going. And it can be as simple as, we heard about so-and-so down the street, the hospital or the ambulance was here and he's in the hospital now, and that's too bad. And you know, that's something we can all relate to because we see ambulances once in a while picking up people we know, or someone is sick and in the hospital. That can be a great time to say to our family members, you know, if something happens to me, this is what I would like done. Or this is where I keep my papers. We should maybe review them sometime because things can happen.
You know what I love about that is from the grieving perspective of somebody who works with the grieving, I have been very open with my children to the point I had my butt hauled into school because they thought my daughter was obsessed with death. And she drew a picture of the funeral home we had went to, and I had to explain what I did for a living. But what I have found is these conversations are natural for us. So death and dying is just part of our home. Like our vet comes in when an animal is sick into our home. And so this is just, I have actively made it part of it. So they're even in their late 20s working on that will. They're even going, okay, what do I want to? And I think even the thought of, this might sound a little crass, I guess, but there's wealth to be had. And so your children will want to have that conversation for that reason. Like, you know, here, I've built all this up. I want my legacy to continue, and I want that to continue with you. So even that money conversation, I think, would entice people to want to talk. Some of the challenges I know, just like looking through the book and grasping what I kind of want to know the role of an executor. And you're an executor advisor. And as a person who is in that role, I found it exhausting. And I didn't know, I'm going to mind what I say. I didn't know shit. I was like, what? So I was relying on a lawyer that never answered. And, you know, I was like, and I remember, and it was for my in-laws. And I called the lawyer and I said, look, I work in the field of grief. You are traumatizing these people by never answering them. You're never answering. They have no guidance. They're sitting here and their mother is dead. So please just reply. So what is it exactly does an executor do? And what does an advisor do? Because I would have loved to have you.
Okay, well, a certified executor advisor is a member of the Canadian Institute of Certified Executor Advisors, as I am. I sit on their board actually and wrote part of their curriculum, but they've also now expanded into the US. And I don't recall it. This is relatively new, Christine. I don't recall the website address offhand, but through my website, do not ignore yourmortality.com, there are links to all kinds of things like this. But a certified executor advisor like myself is someone who's aware of all the different nuances of the various roles that ultimately help executors, from accountants who help out, and when an accountant is typically should be consulted, or you know, any of the other number of professionals, from funeral directors to financial advisors to psychologists to people, realtors to help sell property, and all those various roles that can help. But the role of an executor is very tough, and I delicately wrote about this within the book. I think my viewpoint being unbiased, because I'm not with a funeral home, I'm not with a financial planning firm, but I have all this experience, and I bring a truly unbiased approach to this book to really just tell people how it is with what I've experienced, real life experience from both the funeral and financial planning industry, and as a hospice volunteer too.
Yeah.
But the role of an executor, survey after survey proves, Christine, that most people would never want to be an executor ever again.
Yep.
I often say to people, it's like having a really hard part-time job for about 2 years. And you can't go back and ask the person who set it up because they're dead. That's why all of this, here's the core of my message, that a high-level core, Christine, that really hits home with people when I explain this. The vital essence of proactive end-of-life planning helps reduce the stress of aging. That alone is a massive big deal. But on top of that, the result is, Christine, it leaves our survivors more financially and emotionally resilient. And resiliency is a big issue in our society today. It also leaves them more likely to get along. That's another big issue in today's world, too. It results in more meaningful legacies instead of a disastrous mess being left. And it helps charities out because there are big benefits to donating through planned giving within our estate planning to charities, which desperately need the money. And beyond that, if all of that isn't good enough as it is or enticing enough, all of this ultimately helps the economy. I tell people all the time that I'm astonished that there isn't some sort of political agenda or a push or a tailwind behind this type of message, because our society, our world in general, could certainly use the boost, and more people are dying.
That's so true. That's so true. Interesting. Very interesting. So when you're like, what do you provide? So like, okay, so let's get down to it, because I know you're all thinking it. I'm going to write a will. So I had the conversation. I'm going to write a will. I see online, I can go and write a will. Do I call my lawyer? I know for myself what I did. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. But that being said, I work in the industry, knew people who did it, and decided I needed a will right away. But if you know nothing, you're sitting there, and I know nobody wants to have the conversation. What would be your first step?
Well, it is very common these days, and especially coming through COVID-19, more and more people set up a will online. And there are many platforms now, Christine, that allow people to do this. And it's important to know the difference between when relying on that type of online will planning platform is adequate versus seeing a lawyer. It's only adequate if someone does not have a business interest. You have a business interest. You went to a lawyer. That makes perfect sense. And I'm glad to hear that you did that. But if someone is paying child support or spousal support, they should not be using an online will platform. They should be seeing an experienced estate planning lawyer who does wills all the time, who doesn't just do them every Thursday afternoon, as an example.
Okay.
If someone, and I detail this in my book because it's a critically important aspect, and I wanted to be transparent with people to say, yes, you can set up a will online, but you have to be careful. If someone owns property outside of the jurisdiction where they lived, they should also be seeing a lawyer, right? And if they have any specific types of, if this happens, then I want that to happen. If they have any requests like that, they shouldn't be doing it with basically an online will planning platform, because they don't allow for those types of nuances to be built in. A lawyer knows all the various rules and regulations for your jurisdiction, and they stay up in tune with them. An estate planning will planning platform can be providing the guidance and such based on the jurisdiction where you live, but typically you don't get that one-on-one feedback and advice and guidance from a lawyer. That's why you get what you pay for.
Ultimately, you know, you're reminding me of The Wealthy Barber. And
well, I've studied his I joked about this in the before we started recording here, Christine. I have listened to David Chilton's masterclass program, the Chilton Method, his 17-hour masterclass program, many times, and I've been told that I am starting to sound like him. Yes.
Yeah, because I read his book and I loved his advice about finances. I was never going to put money away to retirement. I don't believe in retiring. I am not retiring. I love my job. I'm going to continue doing it to the day I die.
Me
And
too.
so listen to reading his book and going through the whole thing. Really, I think the first step for somebody who's wanting to go, okay, I need to think about my mortality and write a will and change that perspective from, oh my God, I'm going to die, to look what I have created and my children will have. That's my perspective. My perspective is, look what I've built. I own two corporations. One is a family corporation that I purchased, and my son and daughters work there. They also work in this corporation, and I built this empire for them. Now, if they choose to continue, great. If they don't, they have that wealth for themselves and for their children. So my reason for doing a will is really to celebrate my children and all that I have succeeded in life. And I think no matter how large or how small that success is, right down to your dog, you know, this is important to be put. I think the first step is to buy your book, to buy that book, go through it, highlight what your areas are and what you're thinking of. And then take that next step. So as an advisor, what do you do? Like, can I call you up and you help me? Like, what's
Well, no, I don't want people calling me.
okay. I'm just curious. I'm like, what's that? I love it.
No, I'm being totally honest, Christine.
love it.
I don't. I'm my where I think I can provide the best value to people, and this took me a long time to figure out. It has frustrated the heck out of my wife, to be totally honest with you, but she's been very patient, and I'm so grateful for that. But my greatest value is in creating this book, and it's really just a conversation starter to get people thinking about the importance of having a will. And this applies whether we have wealth or we don't. One example of that is if you die, if your family don't know whether you want to be buried or cremated, as one very simple example, that is something they should know. And the only way that you can actually dictate who's to be in charge of wrapping up your life is to specify it in a will. There is no other way to do that. And if you don't have a will, the government has one for you. And it's not going to be structured likely the way that you want. And everybody's situation is so different.
Well, everybody knows how much I love the Canadian government. And so I would love to go there, because I've had, like, with bereavement and grieving, one of my plights have been to get that expanded. People who have lost a child or relative legally only got 2 bereavement days. Now, obviously, people negotiate this in corporations, and I own 2 corporations, and I know there's a lot of people out there that own corporations and have pushed back at me and said, well, what are we supposed to do? Hire new people while this person grieves? And the simple answer is make it work. And so, when it comes to that will, and I try to explain this a lot to the people who I work with, if we don't have the will, it's kind of like people are going to make it up for you. And I feel like they need more time, at least a week, to grieve, at least to bury somebody. And that's it. I think a week is reasonable for someone to grieve. And they can take bereavement leave if we need it and things like that, but they make it so difficult. So if I don't have a will in Canada, what happens to me if I die?
Well, that's where the government comes into play. And again, I detail this in the book and make it very clear to people. And my mentor suggested that I recruit 25 beta testers to give me feedback as I wrote the whole book. And I did that. They told me what to put in it. It was an awesome suggestion. But I carefully described to readers and listeners of my book what does happen if you don't have a will. And that's where basically the court where you lived makes the decision in regards to who's doing what. And they may nominate someone in your family to be the administrator of your estate, but it creates added complexity. It slows things down immensely. And if we don't have our affairs in order, like as you say that you do, Christine, and it's so great to hear that. But if people don't lean into this while the opportunity exists and have these conversations before an illness is on the table or somebody dies suddenly or whatever the situation is, and that's happening all the time, all around us, but people are tuned out. But to have these conversations in advance when minds are clear and time is plentiful is vitally important.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I know even just myself, my parents, as they aged, dynamics changed in our family. And I was working with the same lawyer, and the lawyer said, "Oh, tell your parents they need to update their will." I was like, "Ooh, how do I have that conversation? Should you
Yes.
said that to me? How do I go and say, hey, by the way, I was reading my will and you should update yours?" And, I was just like, how do I have this conversation? And, thankfully I just walked in and was like, "Hey, Dad, I went to do some stuff with the lawyer. You need to update your will." And he was kind of like, "I do?" And I'm like, "Yeah, like you've bought new homes. I bought your company. All these things have changed."
Yeah.
So it's not a one-stop shop. It's something that we kind of revisit.
Yeah.
And I think that once we make it part of, I think parents are doing the best for their family when they start doing this early on, because
Yes.
we're not talking about death and grief in school systems at all. We don't want to talk about it in society, but hell, we'll talk about sex just like
Yeah.
every day. And I'm just like, complete the circle. Just bring this topic up. For years, people were fighting to be able to talk about sexual preferences and all this type of stuff, which I absolutely love. Now I would love those people to start going, okay, what happens with that person you love? And what if they die? Or how do we prepare our children for all these changes? So I'm hoping that wills, death, dying, grieving will come to the same fruition over time.
Yes.
And so some of the things that I kind of wanted to just touch on, and you can expand on because I've only read a little bit about, but you have something. What is the Coffin Club? This kind of
Well,
I read the name and I was like, what is that?
well, that's part of a small section in my book, Christine, that you're referring to. And yes, I do mention that a retired nurse in New Zealand back in about 2010 formed what she called it was just an informal gathering, I guess, of people that wanted to basically build their own casket or coffin. And then it evolved into coffin clubs expanding around the world where people want to talk about this. And really what you're referring to, and I was a part of it for years and didn't realize this, Christine, it's all part of the death positive movement. And we're seeing that up here in Canada, medical assistance in dying is a very controversial topic right now and continues to be. And for people that they know that there's no cure, they're going to die, and they're living in intense pain, as you referenced earlier. Seeing our family members go through that is horrible, as you said. And there's some people that don't agree with MAID, but it's growing in popularity up here in Canada. More and more people are taking advantage of it. I've got a family member right now who's relatively young. He's in his early 60s and had a stroke, and he's mentioned to me that he's thinking of it. And I'm thinking that, if God forbid I'm ever in a wheelchair at some point and I can't remember relatives' names and such, I may opt for that sort of ending as well. But they're very controversial topics, all of these things. But I just wanted to stress that death positive movement topic issue, because again, Christine, I was in it for a long time and didn't realize that this is all part of it.
Yep. And I love just seeing how people are starting to step up and talk about it. And they're starting to realize this is a part of life. Like the last podcast I was doing, I actually brought up Freud because his was the very first person that touched on this besides Kubler-Ross. And when he touched on it, he said it's a normal human experience and it's one that we fear. And I think people are so fearful of the topic. That's why they don't want to have the conversation. Nobody wants to talk about their own death.
Yes.
Everybody is scared.
And I think a couple other reasons too. Christine, pertain to people don't think there's any big urgency. They're not going to die. It happens to somebody else. It's not going to happen to me, but it does. We all know that. But the
Yeah.
other aspect too is I think people don't necessarily think they have enough assets to make it worthwhile, and they don't know where to turn.
Well, and that's one of the biggest things that I even fell into that, not thinking I had enough to give. And I thought that's crazy because it boiled down to my dog. I went, my dog needs to go somewhere. And,
Yeah.
like it boiled down to simple things, such as the things I collected over my life that meant something to me. I started to think about it and I thought, I don't have a lot when I was younger, but I went in and said, I want to make sure when I die that not everybody's going, well, what is she like? The only thing they knew was I wanted a nice blue coffin with lots of gaudy stuff because I love color. And it was always the joke that I'm going to be buried in bright colors. And but that was it. And that's when I started to go, hey, I got to figure out. And a lot of people don't understand that the funeral, the will, and everything is for the grieving. They
It
think
is. Yeah.
this is for me. No, this is not for me. Part of it is I love the fact that I feel comfortable where I'm at, but it's for the grieving. When someone is grieving and they're standing there, all they want to do is do your wishes. All they want to do is when that person has died, they want to make sure, like they'll go beyond this world to just make sure that the right coffin, the right this, the right, and they're so hyper focused that, I'm standing next to them going, it's okay. But if there's a will there and it's written out, oh my goodness, that process for them, this is what my mom wanted, this is what my dad wanted. I'm so glad that I can provide it. So it's really not just for you, it's for your family. And
Right.
all of us are putting our family first. That's the way we are. So I think
Well,
it's the biggest thing to go for.
yeah, I agree. We all want a better life for our children, as an example. And you're exactly right, Christine. All of this really comes down to love, doesn't it? And
Mhm.
wanting the best for our family. But the other aspect that plays into this as well is that the number of people, widely speaking, across Canada and the US, and I'm sure in many other parts of the world too, they don't see the value in a traditional funeral like they used to.
Yeah.
Again, I quote in my book that the average cost of a funeral in US dollars used to be about $6,600, I believe it was. But more and more people are not wanting anything.
Mhm.
They may just want some sort of celebration of life, or maybe a get together at a location or whatever. So that's changing, and in some cases, they may not want anything to happen at all. But as you said, this sort of celebration or funeral or whatever people want to call it is for the living. And
Yeah.
if they want to have some sort of get together to help them get through this, well,
Yeah.
they should be allowed to do that, even if the deceased says, oh, don't worry about me. I don't want anything. Just bury me in the backyard. It's not as simple as that.
No, it isn't. And it's for me. Like I have planned out, and just because my mind is always there, I always look at my aging parents and things like this, and I know exactly what I would do for each of them. And then they're like,
Yeah.
what? This is for me, man. I'm riding my motorcycle in the front of every one of you because that's the joy I've had with my family. And so it really is for the living. One of the other things I wanted to talk about, because this comes up often, is what's a valid will? Like, what's the difference? I think a lot of people may go, well, how do I know if it's valid?
Right. Well, it's important for the will to be. It's vitally important for anyone's will, and whether it was created through an online will planning platform for $100 or whatever the cost is for that, or if someone sees an estate planning lawyer and may spend hundreds of dollars perhaps having wills and medical directives and everything put together, which is actually a much better, more thorough route. But a will has to be acceptable in the eyes of a judge
Mm.
where one lived in that jurisdiction. And that's the role of the executor. The executor is wrapping up someone's life who has died. And that executor, or estate trustees, as they're sometimes called, and there can be more than one, it's actually better to have more than one, basically put that document in front of a judge to basically be approved. And that judge has to approve it. So if it's not following the rules of that area, and all these jurisdictions, provinces and states, et cetera, have slightly different rules as to what constitutes a valid will,
Mhm.
it may not be valid, and it's not worth risking that, in my opinion. You're far better off to do it right the first time.
And so how would you notice on paper that it's not valid? Like it has to
Well,
go somewhere to be, uh,
Well, there are some will planning platforms that have existed for quite a long time where they just give you the documents, a very generic type of will planning template that you can print off and fill in the blanks sort of thing and sign it. Those sorts of offerings online should be avoided at all cost. But the ones that have some sort of legal involvement in regards to different jurisdictions
Mhm.
and tailor the approach based on where someone is living, that gives far more reassurance that it's going to be acceptable in the eyes of a judge.
Oh, okay, that's good. And I think people don't understand. Like I thought wills were like thousands of dollars. My will cost me $667. And it's a thorough will because I own two corporations. Um, and I was really surprised on how cost effective it was. I thought, and it lasts for decades, right? If
Yeah.
nothing changes. So it really isn't as much. And I'm in Ontario, Canada. I thought it was going to be a lot of money. What's the average cost of a will? Do you know that?
It's hard to say, Christine, what the average cost is, but based on the numbers that we had just shared, I think those are legitimate.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too,
Yeah.
that there are. And so one of the other things I saw that I found interesting was there were actually famous people who never did this. And
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, share a little bit about that. Like they just and wealthy people just kind of skipped over the well.
Yeah, well, it's very true. There's all kinds of people who die suddenly and don't plan around it. Aretha Franklin,
Mm,
the famous, very famous singer from the States, I believe, died without a will, and they later found a handwritten will of some sort in her couch or something, if I recall correctly. Prince was another one, a very famous musician who died without a will, and there's a famous actor who died 2 or 3 years ago, and I think his last name was Brosman.
mhm.
I forget his first name, but there are all kinds of people who I'm sure didn't expect to die, and
Yeah,
there's their family basically wringing their hands, wondering what to do, and trying to decide who's in charge, or I should say, let me rephrase that, having to go with what the courts deem who's in charge of
yeah,
wrapping up the estate, and leads to all kinds of estate litigation, which is incredibly expensive, which
yeah.
can be avoided for the most part, especially if family members are involved in these conversations like you and your family have done, because that reduces the risk of someone contesting the will down the road after the death.
Yeah. And I can just imagine how much everybody's making besides the family, right? Besides
Yeah.
the family and what the family should be getting. So to kind of just bring closure to this, I've loved this conversation. Um, I think the very first thing um, I would think that somebody needs to do to have this conversation about the will, or if you wanted to start to do your will, would be to get your book. I think this will guide them through, and they'll be able to read that independently on themselves. I even think I do a thing where I put a book on a coffee table. And then people are like, what are you reading? And then I'm able to say, I'm reading a book on how to create a will. So even just the presence of something like that,
Yeah.
and even speaking to my listeners, even just saying you heard this podcast. Like I was listening to Grief Uprooted and they started talking about wills. I know we talk about grief, which is usually after somebody dies, but I think this is such a great conversation because we're preparing for what is inevitably to come. So what else would you suggest to anybody listening before we close this up?
Well, my book can be found through my website, do not ignore your mortality.com, and it's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and all the major retail platforms in ebook and audiobook as well, where I narrate it. But the other thing that I've done, Christine, which it may sound a little goofy, but I came up with these little, what I call conversation coasters. And I've had so many people tell me over the years, well, I'll set up my funeral when I get around to it, or I'll buy the life insurance when I get around to it. And it's
Yeah.
just a little round to it, literally, with my logo on the other side
Oh, I
that I
love
can
it.
that I can provide to people too, that again can help stimulate these conversations. And those probing legacy questions are free to anyone. I just ask that they contact me through my website and provide me with their name and address so I can stay in touch, because I want to elevate this. And people that are curious are obviously wanting to help in some way too. But this message helps our survivors in so many ways, and people just need to lean into this and get talking about it.
So how do I get that coaster? I love that.
Well, I have to ask my wife to make more of them up. She's got a cricket machine in
That's
her
such
craft room downstairs. But it's just a neat little way can you imagine if this little round to it was sitting
yeah.
on the coffee table beside the book? That's going to capture people's attention and say, what is that? And it's a great way to bring up the conversation.
I love it because like even I'm leaving to do a keynote speech. I have little ceramic hearts I made, and they're feeling hearts. And the fact that we're united and connected, love to have some of those just to throw out and watch people go, what is that? Because, and that's literally what we're doing is we're bringing attention
Yes.
to this positive movement. And I think it's amazing that so many people are jumping on and joining it. Because it just needs to be talked about. And I think building a better world for the next generation.
Yeah, I agree. And that's one of the things, Christine, that the funeral business taught me. I had a lot of friends and such that thought it was, odd that I would want to become a funeral director when I was 20 years of age. And some wanted to talk about it and others would just avoid it, as you can imagine. But we can't help it. We all get to the stage in life, hopefully a long way off, and we live a good quality of life between now and then. But any of us can die suddenly at the same time. I could have died. I could be dead by now with this
Yep.
brain tumor, but we can't change it. We may as well lean into it and make the best of it.
Yep. And I think it makes for a happier life. A lot of the people that
Yeah.
are listening to this podcast, I know a lot of you are like, I want to feel good again. I want to start moving forward in my grief.
Yeah.
And I think one of the best ways to do that is you've experienced something that's completely life altering. And one of my missions is grief to growth. And I really feel like take this moment and feel your grief, but now grow from it.
Yeah.
Make it better for the next generation. Let's sit down. Let's start the will, buy the coaster, buy the book, start that conversation now so that you are feeling and experiencing your grief, but you could help the next generation not have to be in the same position. Like, just imagine if somebody handed you, here you go, this is your loved one's wishes. It just changes things so very much.
And on top of that, Christine, it can save them a heck of a lot of money, turmoil, and aggravation.
Yep, exactly. And on that note, thank you for tuning in. I'm going to encourage you all to start having that conversation about your will. I'm going to put all the links in the podcast so you can link in to get the book, inquire about the coasters, because I know I'm going to get some. And we need to start having this death positive conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining me today. I think this conversation has been so valuable to so many. So until next time, it is only together that we grieve and is only together that we heal. Take care, everybody. Grief Uprooted professional grief and empowerment coaching are not to be used as a substitute for professional advice by legal, medical, financial, business, spiritual, or other qualified professionals. All our products and services are designed for grief empowerment through learning and sharing of one's lived experiences.